So I asked a question on social media about fairies, the good folk, and human world animals, because I've talked in the past about fairy animals and animals in the fairy world. And I thought I would just make a video here. It would probably be the easiest way to answer this question. And also, there's probably other people out there who are kind of wondering about this. And honestly, it's a very complicated question, as a lot of things are when it comes to the good folk, when it comes to fairies. So we really can't sort of make any blanket statements about fairies and human world animals because it often comes down to the specific types of good folk, types of fairies that we're looking at. I can make a couple sort of broad statements that apply across a few groups, but these are still not going to be like universal applies to every single being. It would just be way more than I could fit in a video to try to talk about every single example of every single specific type of being. So, generally speaking, probably the animal that we have the most material on in folklore relating to fairies is going to be cows. And there's multiple reasons for this, but really just comes down to the fact that cows are a very significant animal culturally across sort of Western Europe. And that cows are also kind of the most sort of expensive and also useful livestock that a farmer could potentially have. So if you have a cow, this would not be a cow that you would kill to eat for the meat, generally speaking. This would be a cow that you would keep more as a dairy cow. You'd have a calf every year. You'd be able to milk it. You get milk, you get butter. In Ireland, and I should content warning this before I say it, um, no cows are killed in this example, but some people might consider this cruel, so just keep that in mind before I say it. In Ireland, for example, they had more of a habit of bleeding the cows, and then they would use the blood to make food, blood pudding, blood sausage, things like that. And the cow itself would not be killed or harmed in a wider sense. I'm not going to get into the ethics of whether bleeding the animals is or is not cruel. That would have to also be sort of a separate video. But my point here is just that cows were generally considered sort of significant property. Having a cow was an important thing, and they provided a lot of things to the community. Because of this, though, there is a lot of folklore, and this goes from, northern France all the way up England, Scotland, Ireland, all of that. There's a lot of folklore about the fairies, the good folk, stealing cows, taking human cows. And the general way this would be done is that the animal would be shot with something called elf shot, which is an invisible arrow that would then cause the animal to either appear to waste away and die, or in some cases waste away and die. But the belief was that when this happened, they were then going to the good folk. They were joining the fairies. In some cases, we also have stories where the cow just literally disappears and is thought to have been taken by the fairies or the good folk. So we see this across a huge range of material. We also see stories where they don't outright steal the cow, but they steal the milk. They go in and take the milk so that then the human, when they go to milk the cow, there's no milk to take. Milk, of course, as I know I've mentioned in other videos, was a very significant item when it comes to fairies. They not only stole it, it was often given to them as an offering, either the milk or the cream, sometimes butter. There's just a very strong connection and a long history going on there. And we also see accounts where the cow is killed and butchered. This is more common, I think, in northern France with like the Lutins, for example. But we see it in other folklore as well. The idea that the fairies would kill the cow for food purposes. That, of course, was sort of a much bigger deal. Not that people enjoyed their cows being stolen away into fairy either, but obviously that's a more destructive kind of approach to it. We do also see accounts, sometimes, for example, like in Wales, where we see cows that are either interbred with fairy cows or like a herd of cows that's watched over or kept by a water bull, a fairy bull. So yeah, it's very fluid in some aspects of it, but cows, major connections with fairies. Cows don't seem to be innately afraid of the good folk. They seem to be open to this sort of influence. There were entire, cunning folk who made their entire profession really around the idea of curing cows or helping elf-shot cows, recovering cows. All of this, it was quite a big deal. Really can't emphasize the social and economic significance of cows. If you haven't sort of done a deep dive into studying that in the culture, particularly in Ireland, but also elsewhere. But it's really, really a significant animal to these farms. We also see mention of the good folk with horses, mortal horses. For example, in Ireland, the horse is supposed to be an animal that is afraid of or responds negatively to the banshee. So we have some anecdotal accounts of, the banshee crying and the horses in the fields like freaking out and tearing around and running off and things like that. So we have some of these more sort of negative associations between the good folk and horses in the human world. We also, of course, have stories relating to dogs. Dogs can kind of go either way when it comes to the good folk. A lot of the stories that I have read show dogs in the human world either not reacting particularly to otherworldly beings or sometimes even reacting like positively to otherworldly beings. But there are a few stories as well where dogs do not react well to fairies being around and, freak out and bark and all of that. So, again, personalized to the dog, personalized to the type of fairy being that we're discussing, a little bit of range of variety there. Cats, we don't actually have a lot of folklore when it comes to cats and fairies. It is important to keep in mind that cats are obviously not originally native to Ireland or the UK. They were a species that was introduced. This is also true for hares and rabbits, by the way. There's a species that was introduced. Actually, let me correct myself, not hares. Hares are native. The brown rabbit was introduced by the Romans. So I don't want to spread any misinformation there. Rabbits, not native. And cats, not native. They were introduced. And what this means really is that we don't have the same range of folklore. When cats show up in folklore, they're more likely to be sort of suspicious or possibly not an actual like earth animal. We see a lot of stories of cats as shape-changed witches. We see a lot of stories of cats as fairies, the cat she, the fairy cat who can appear as a cat or can take on other forms and generally is kind of malevolent. So that's sort of where the folklore is at with it. Modern accounts, modern stories, much like dogs, we tend to see this sort of division between people talking about cats who seem very pro-fairy, who enjoy having fairies around, react well to fairies. Then we see accounts of cats who get very freaked out, chase things that can't be seen, cry, stare into, space. I mean, cats are strange animals to begin with. So how much of this is normal cat behavior and how much of this is the other crowd? I don't know. But these are the stories that we have. And it kind of gives us this complicated picture when it comes to both dogs and cats. And it really is going to come down in those cases to what specific type of fairy being we're talking about. And also, I think a lot of times just the temperament of that particular animal. And outside that, we have various stories of types of fairies who are known to hunt, including mortal animals, humans as well, but things like deer, the cows, which you already talked about, anything like that can kind of fall into this zone. Swans are another one. They're not always what they appear. So really when we get into the connection between swans and fairies, we're getting into this idea that swans could be fairies, that they're not always what they appear to be. They can be shape changed. Actually, I find that a lot in Irish mythology, people getting shape changed into swans. So it doesn't really talk about the connection that the other folk, the fairies might have to swans in this world, but there's a lot of mythology and folklore connecting swans and fairies in a more direct, sort of interchangeable kind of sense. Deer are another really complicated one. Deer in the mortal world are said in several types of folklore to be the milking herd, the cows of the fairies. We see that in a couple references in Irish mythology. We also see it in Scotland, particularly relating to beings like the Glastig or the Banshee, these sort of fairy women who live in the wilderness, in some cases like the Glastig, are loosely associated with households. This idea that they might have the hooves of deer, and that they also have this connection to deer, to wild deer, who they milk as if they were cows. So definitely some complicated layers with deer as well. Of course, we also have a lot of otherworldly deer, so that kind of gets a little confusing. For example, seeing a white deer is supposed to be an omen or a message from the other world. Thomas the Rhymer, when the fairy queen sent for him to return to the world of fairy, it said that she sent 2 deer. I've read some versions of that story that claim they were white deer and that that's how he recognized what they were. And then he follows them and disappears from the human world. We have other accounts of, deer appearing to lead people to things or to places. In the mythology and the stories around Finn McCool, he, of course, marries a woman who is initially in the form of a deer. It returns to a humanoid form. She's under a curse from a fairy druid, and then later disappears, and he does not find her again in the story, but he finds his son, who was born from the deer mother, his wife, and he names his son Sheen, which means little deer. So again, these layers of connections between the good folk and deer, fairies and deer. One thing I should backtrack a little: fairies and horses that I did forget to mention, and this touches on other types of livestock as well. So fairies with horses, fairies with sheep, those 2 animals in particular, they are known to be prone to harassing them, taking them out at night, riding them around until the animal's exhausted. They will knot their wool in the case of sheep, or manes in the case of horses. These are called elf knots, fairy knots. And supposedly it's, according to some of the stories, being done so that they have reins or stirrups or a way to direct the animal. The idea generally is that they are not a good thing, that they're causing the animal a lot of stress and harm, and that one of the indications that that is happening is finding these knots in the animals, again, the wool or the mane, the next day. And there's ways to protect against that. Usually hanging up like a hagstone in the barn is one of the main ones. So when it comes to the wider idea of fairies, of the good folk with animals in the mortal world, animals on earth, very complicated when we look across the older folklore and, some of the modern beliefs. Some animals they seem to have a more positive relationship with. A lot of human world animals they either prey on, or have a much more negative association with, like we see with the elflocks. In modern demographic folklore, so what we might call pop culture folklore, the material that's been really impacted by theosophy and the New Age movement, we do see this idea of fairies and the good folk as protectors of the natural world and of animals. So we do see stories now where fairies are like explicitly out to protect animals, to protect wildlife in particular. You'll run across things in like modern witchcraft books that talk about invoking or calling on the fairies to protect your house pets or to find lost pets, things like that. And that is certainly a modern view. It is folklore that is out there now, but it does differ from the older material we find. In the older material, they are definitely not in that same sort of a positive caretaker role for these things. We could maybe argue a little bit the wild deer that they use as their cows, because there is sort of a sense there that they kind of protect them and then treat them like they're the fairies' livestock, basically. But outside of that, what we find a lot of times with stories in the older folklore and the cultural folklore of the good folk and animals is that they're either harming the animal or, eating the animal, basically. We don't really see a lot of this idea that they are protecting them or that there's certain animals that they have like a special concern for, except for the wild deer, as I did just mention. Now, the modern concept, of course, we see a very different picture. We see this idea that they um, are sort of vegetarians. They wouldn't eat the animal because they don't do that. And they're very invested in protecting them, helping them, returning baby birds to nests, things like that. So there is sort of that dichotomy going on between the various streams of folklore. And, I don't want to get too sidetracked into the modern New Age theosophical based views uh, because we'd really just constantly be rehashing this idea that they're protective and helpful to these animals. Whereas, in the other folklore, we see something different. And I don't think that this is a case of one is right and one is wrong. I think, again, this is a case where we really need to just look at which specific types of beings we're talking about and which specific animals we're talking about, and what exactly the stories are. For the sort of smaller, sprite-like, Tinkerbell-like good folk that are out there, are they protective of animals? Those are the ones that mainly appear in the more modern pop culture stories in that context. So, entirely possible. We can believe that. That's the folklore. But when we're talking about things like I mentioned, the French Lutins, the Aishi in Ireland, who are very prone to this cow theft, cow abduction thing. Very different picture. And again, the stories that we have, and this is really all across the Celtic speaking countries of the elf locks, fairy locks. The idea that they take the animals out and ride them around at night until they're exhausted and, cause mats or knots in their mane or their wool. This also happens with sheep. Obviously, that's not a very positive thing. And it's definitely not an indication that the good folk are, concerned for the welfare of these animals. So, lots of different stories, lots of material to cover here. I know I'm trying to do this in a reasonably short video because I don't want to just end up repeating myself too much. I think we've covered really the highlights with this. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. We are talking about animals in the human world versus fairies. I did not get into how humans fit into this, although humans are obviously animals, a type of animal. That would be, again, multiple other videos I've already done about how the good folk interact with humans and how humans interact with them. But on the general subject of human world, earth animals, and the good folk, this is kind of what we see across the Western European belief. Again, there's a huge range of stories here. There are multiple different options depending on what specific type of being we're looking at. I've not covered everything in minute detail here just because it would be a lot of repeating very similar stories. But that's kind of the highlights of it. So, how they act to human world animals often really comes down to just that particular group of fairies, what their agenda is, and whether they think that animal is tasty or useful or entertaining or not. And it seems like the ones that fall into the not category kind of get ignored by the good folk, and the ones that fall into the yes category, as we've already discussed, usually doesn't work out too well for them when they have the attention of the good folk, the attention of the fairies, barring those modern New Age theosophical views, which position them as like protectors of those animals. So, that wraps that up. I hope that answers the original question. If anyone has additional questions, please drop it in the comments, and I will see about doing another video and maybe digging more into whatever it is you're curious about. And I will see everyone later.